Dr. Dobersek is an associate professor of psychology at USI. She's received a Bachelor's of Art in Psychology, Master's in General Experimental Psychology, and PhD in Sport and Exercise Psychology. She teaches sports psychology and research career-related courses. Her research focuses on body image, mate selection, and the relation between diet and mental health. She has published over 100 peer-reviewed abstracts, publications, and book chapters. And without further ado, it's all yours.
Well, thank you, Adam, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. So what I would like to share today with you is a little bit of, or some of the research we have been doing over the past number of years on the relation between diet, or dietary preferences, and mental health from both disease-centered perspective, such as depression, anxiety, and positive psychology perspective, or a mental health perspective, if you will, such as, for example, self-esteem. But before I continue, I would like to acknowledge some of the entities that enabled me to engage in this research, and of course students as well as colleagues, and at the same time I am declaring my conflict of interest. In the past I have been funded by the internal grants from the university, college, as well as the external grants from National Government's BIP Association. I would also like to share or state that I am not a licensed or registered dietitian, so I am not here to tell you what to eat and what not to eat. That is your choice, but I'm here to share a little bit about our findings in terms of the research that we have been doing over the past few years. So in 2017, WHO, or World Health Organization, reported that mental illness was the leading cause of disability worldwide. And it has a major impact on cardiovascular diseases, which are the leading cause of mortality globally. So here are some of the most prevalent, especially, for example, depression and anxiety. These two disorders are two of the most prevalent disorders worldwide, as well as here in the United States. So there are some other disorders, such as, for example, a lot of individuals experience trauma, whether that would be emotional, physical, sexual trauma as a child, or later on in adulthood. Different personality disorders, borderline personality disorders, substance use disorders. A number of individuals use different types of drugs, as well as other addictive behaviors, such as, for example, exercise. Even though we believe that exercise is healthy, right, that's something we should engage in, but it can become, if it's engaged or it's interfering with our daily life, it can become addictive behavior. Psychotic disorders, eating disorders, obsessive compulsive disorders, and many, 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 many others. So here is a little bit about the worldwide prevalence. So we have about 30 million individuals that suffer from anxiety worldwide, and that's according to, again, WHO, World Health Organization. And then leading by depression, and then we have a steep drop, and about 40 million suffer from bipolar disorder, and about 14 million from eating disorders. And we see similar pattern, especially in anxiety and depression, here in the United States. And this is a report from National Institute of Mental Health, where we have about 19% of individuals suffer from anxiety, and then we have depression, 3.6 from trauma or PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and we also see a little bit of bipolar disorder. So those are some of the most prevalent disorders here in the United States. So in addition to increase in mental health or mental illnesses over the past couple of decades, there has also been increase in restrictive diets. And what I mean by that, or what we mean by restrictive diets, that individuals are omitting certain food groups, such as, for example, being certain type of vegetarian or vegan. where individuals are omitting completely all animal-based foods. They are becoming more popular as well as more prevalent, not only here in the United States, but also worldwide. And here I just have a picture in terms of what kind of food groups we can, or individuals do omit. From, for example, completely eating only fruits, to being raw vegan, and then we have different types of vegetarians, where, for example, lacto-vegetarians, they are omitting, we don't see here eggs, for example, ovo-vegetarians, and then we have combination, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, flexitarians, or semi-vegetarians, which are individuals who eat meat once in a while, but not necessarily on a regular basis, which would be omnivores, right? Individuals who consume everything at any point in time. Then we also have pescatarians, where they consume fish as well as other products, animal-based products, except meat, red meat, poultry, white meat, and so on. So then it's also, we have that idea of kind of dividing, right, what is healthy and what is unhealthy. So for example, we may consider as healthy plant-based diet and lean meats, perhaps, right? And fruit. And then on the other side, we have sort of unhealthy things, such as processed foods, processed meat, fast food, and so on. But if we think a little bit about that, is there really such a thing as healthy and unhealthy, right? Maybe. But, for example, if we have an individual or a child who is underweight, malnourished, and lacking a lot of different nutrients, would plant-based diet and salad be good for them? Or perhaps for at least some period of time, in order to get their calories back, burger and fries, maybe a little bit better to get more calories. On the other hand, if we have an individual who may be perhaps suffering from some cardiovascular issues, lack of exercise, as well as being overweight, burger and fries may not be perhaps good for that individual, right? So I would argue that what is healthy and what is unhealthy, it's context dependent, right? And we also have a lot of entities, such as public dietitian researchers as well as policymakers, do not agree what constitutes of healthy diet versus unhealthy diet, right? Just something to think about. And we do have, in terms of the relation between these two things, dietary preference and mental health, there is a great deal of contradictory evidence. On the one side, a great deal of the research suggests that omitting certain foods, such as being vegan and vegetarian, is associated with better mental health, with lower depression, lower anxiety, and better mood states. But on the other side, we have also a great deal of research and evidence suggesting that vegans and vegetarians suffer from greater depression, greater anxiety, greater self-harm, and suicidal ideations, comparing to individuals who are omnivores, who eat pretty much everything. So the question is, kind of what contributes to such a great disparity in the literature overall? Well, there are a couple of explanations, or possible explanations. One is kind of overall the idea of research methods, right? What do we use in order to answer the research question? And that is related, or can be related to design. Are we using a sound, rigorous designs, or are we using primarily perhaps cross-sectional or correlational research versus true experimental, such as randomized controlled trials, right? Another thing that contributes to disparity is assessment. How are we assessing assessment methods? So how are we assessing what individuals are eating, and how are we assessing mental health? And for the most part, in nutrition field, as well as public health, individuals use what they call memory-based methods. And what it's like, and what this is like is, I ask you, what did you eat in the past 24 hours? Or what did we eat in the past 48 hours? Or in the past week? How many can remember what we ate? Sort of, right? Many of us, perhaps. Or unless you're really diligent and you are keeping track of what you're eating, as well as your calories, right? Many of us may not remember, but many of us might, right? And even if we do remember, let's say we had yesterday for snack an apple or a banana. Well, the other question is, how big was that banana or that apple, right? Because it may include, and also what type of apple there is. And there are many, many different types of apples, and they may have different nutritional content. So there's a lot of questions that are kind of unanswered, or we may not be able to accurately and reliably measure those kind of things. So those include, like I mentioned, 24-hour dietary recall. So again, what do you eat for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and so on. And also FFQs, or food frequency questionnaire. So to what extent do we eat, for example, meat? Do we eat it every day? Whenever we do eat it, how much do we eat it? How big the steak is, and so on. Right? So there's a big, big, big issue in that. And our dietary guidelines for Americans are based on these memory-based methods. And that is called National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES, which we started back in the 1960s, where we were interested, or the government was interested in how are we doing in terms of our physical health and our mental health across America. And ever since then, every year we collect this kind of information. And there is a group of researchers that use this data set, and they were interested in to what extent the what we report or self-report, can we survive on the foods that we state that we eat? And what we have over here is the distinction between men and women. So on the left we have men, and on the women, women, and on the right we have men. And I will, for the simplicity, round up the numbers. So what this means over here on the left-hand side, about 70% of women reported that they have energy intake, or the foods that they eat would not be able to survive on. The data were inadmissible. And a little bit less, about 60% of men stated that they would not be able to survive on the foods that they eat, based on the statistical analysis. Okay. So think a little bit about that. How accurate or reliable our dietary guidelines for America are. Just food for thought. So another explanation could be confounding variables, or something else that is associated, or that sort of plays a role in relation between dietary patterns and mental health, such as, for example, our biological sex, our socioeconomic status. It could be our lifestyle. Do we smoke? We don't smoke. Do we exercise? We don't exercise, and so on. So there are many, many, many other variables that can play a role in this relation and contribute to the contradictory evidence. And then finally, how do we collect the information? How do we recruit individuals to collect that information? And there's a great deal of biased recruitment and sampling, specifically what we call non-probability sampling or convenience sampling, and then also oversampling for individuals who are vegans and vegetarians. So in general, most of us eat everything, right? So then the researchers would oversample for vegans and vegetarians. And that's not very representative of kind of across the dietary preferences, right? So those are some of the possible explanations, and I'm sure there are many, many, many others as well. So the way we were at least trying to explain some of this explanation is through doing systematic reviews. And what it is we are looking at the prior literature. So we are not conducting what we call primary study, where we would recruit individuals, participants, to complete our questionnaires or to participate in our study, but our unit of analysis were previous articles that have already been published. And what we see over here is a pyramid on it's called sort of pyramid of quality of evidence. So on the top are systematic reviews, which is basically a review of the past studies done in a systematic way. And that provides the most evidence, or the greatest level of evidence that there is, comparing to, for example, experiments and other types of correlational studies, for example, right? Which many individuals are doing, and we do have different types of reviews that are out there, depending on the purpose. So for example, systematic review many times is kind of combined with what they call meta-analysis. So with a systematic review, we're looking at explaining relation in a qualitative way. So let's say if we have 10 studies that we found on the topic, we would describe 8 out of 10 studies found this. 2 studies found the opposite findings, for example. Whereas with meta-analysis, we quantify that relation. We pinpoint specifically what is the strength of that relation using statistical analysis. Okay? So it's a one step beyond that. Then we have narrative reviews, scoping reviews, rapid reviews, review of a review, which is an umbrella review, or meta review, mapping reviews. So there are many, many, many different reviews out there. So our focus was on performing a couple of systematic reviews, as well as doing a scoping review. So the purpose of scoping review is to look at the evidence that is out there and see kind of what is out there. We may not exactly know how much evidence is out there. So we are looking at what scope are we dealing with. And we did it primarily for looking at mental health from the positive perspective in relation to diet. So first, I'm going to share a couple of the reviews from the disease center perspective in relation to diet. So we focused on a systematic review looking at the relation to depression, anxiety, and some other types of psychological variables. So in terms of the way we go about conducting a review is to first, obviously, know what we're going to do, determine the topic and specific variables. And then we determine what exactly are we going to search for. So in our case, we were interested in mental health and dietary patterns, but specifically we were interested in individuals who consume meat and individuals who do not consume meat, so vegans and vegetarians. So we had a very, very clear distinction between these two groups, right? Versus to what extent do we eat meat? Okay. So, for example, similar is, are we smokers or non-smokers? Right? Very clear. Even though there can be categorization bias, but it's less likely, for example. Right? Another inclusion criteria we had was that the article had to deal with some kind of mental health disorder. Anxiety, depression, could also be put positive, well-being, self-harm, suicide perhaps, and so on. We also were looking at only studies that were written in English language due to we did not have any sort of co-authors who were able to speak Spanish, for example. And we did not have any date restriction on that, published at any point in time. And we were using about 5 databases through the library. And once we searched that, we had about a little bit over 7,600 articles. And we went through every single article, looking at their first title and abstract. And based on that, then we decided whether or not the studies were relevant. And from that, we identified 115 articles. So a great deal of this first preliminary kind of swifting through the articles was done by the students. And from that 115, we excluded other, such as the outcome was irrelevant. They did not measure sort of major typical disorders. There were, for example, clinician report, editorials. We excluded reviews and meta-analysis, but we did look at their references. And then from that, we had about 20 studies met our inclusion criteria. Another important step in a review, or specifically in a systematic review, is looking through all of these 20 articles and determining the quality of them. Is it high rigor, high quality study, or is it somewhat moderate, or it's somewhat low? So we would read every single article and assess it, each part of the article. So going through the introduction, what were the statistical methods, how did they recruit participants, and so on. So if you remember, whenever I mentioned some of the possible explanations for the discrepancy in the relation between diet and meat, or diet and mental health, this is where that comes in. So we were also looking at to what extent study quality can explain that relation. So what we found is couple primary outcomes. So we divided the mental health variables into primary and secondary outcomes. And we found about 9 studies on depression and anxiety favored meat consumers, meaning that they had lower levels of anxiety and depression. And about 2 studies favored vegans and vegetarians, meaning that these 2 studies show that vegans and vegetarians have lower levels of anxiety and depression. On secondary outcomes, we had self-harm, mood, quality of life, and well-being. So we have less studies here, and there is also less clear distinction among the studies. So we have 4 that favor meat eaters. So again, meat eaters had lower levels of self-harm, better mood, better quality of life, and well-being, versus 3 who favored vegans and vegetarians. And then from here, we decided to do a follow-up, which was meta-analysis, only on the most 2 prevalent mental health disorders, which are, as we learned, depression and anxiety. So what we found here is the following. I will first orient you to this strange, funny graph, which is called forest plot. So on the left side here, we have the first author of the study and when it was published in a parenthesis. And the studies are organized based on that quality of study, to what rigor each study has. So it is organized from the highest quality to the lowest quality. Okay? And then over here, we have that strength of the relation, which is called an effect size, specifically HGG. And then we have confidence intervals, p-values. And then over here on the right-hand side, those values are plotted. And each square represents a study. And the bigger the square, the more participants the study has. And the line, or those whiskers, through the square represent confidence intervals. So the smaller the confidence interval, if you notice, the larger the study, the more participants it has, the smaller the confidence interval, right? And then over here in the middle, that would denote that there is no difference between the groups. There's no difference between meat consumers and meat abstainers. Specifically, this graph represents the pressure. And any studies that are on the right-hand side from that zero means that meat consumers have lowered the pressure levels compared to meat abstainers. Studies on the left-hand side from that zero show that meat abstainers have lowered the pressure levels. Okay? So what we see, I made a circle over here, that the higher the quality of the study, the more it favors meat consumers, meaning that meat consumers have lowered the pressure levels in higher quality of studies. Comparing to, if we see a lower quality of studies, they're kind of all over the place. And on the bottom here, this diamond represents the overall effect. And the size of the diamond represents confidence interval. So kind of overall effect, it favors the meat consumers, even though this number is not really great, it's a kind of low effect, but it still favors meat consumers, meaning that meat consumers have lower the pressure levels. We see the same patterns for anxiety. We had smaller number of studies, but the patterns are very, very similar over here on the right-hand side. And if you remember, I mentioned the quality of study is very important, so that's something that we wanted to assess, to see what role it plays in this relation. So this is called bubble plot, and it's specifically for depression variable. On the x-axis, we have quality score, which closer to 100, so this would be the highest quality, the most rigorous. The closer to 0, the lower the quality, the less confidence we have in the results. And then on the y-axis, we have that effect size, the strength of that relation. And those bubbles represent studies. And the size of the bubbles represent within study variance. So the larger the study, the smaller number of participants they have. So this is kind of the opposite of what we saw before. So if you notice over here, so this is the regression line, right? It's the greater the quality of the study, the more rigorous the study, the greater the stronger the relation favoring meat consumers. Okay? And we see the same pattern here for anxiety, even though there are less studies here. So the next step that we wanted to investigate was to look at, well, do findings or results or the evidence, is it similar whenever we're looking at the mental health from a positive perspective? So the previous two reviews were done from the disease center perspective, looking at the disorders. Here, the next couple of reviews, we're looking at the positive psychological variables, such as self-esteem, quality of life, positive mental health, and so on. So we first looked at how much evidence is out there. So we did not really specify specific, for example, what we had for depression, anxiety only. Here we looked at a lot of different positive psychological variables, just to look at the scope. And this is what we found. We have primary outcomes, life satisfaction, self-esteem, positive mental health, and vigor. And as you can see, a lot of unsure results. So NS meaning that there was no difference between meat consumers and meat abstainers. And we had two studies that favored meat eaters, meaning that meat eaters had greater life satisfaction, greater self-esteem, and so on, whereas we did not find any studies that favored vegans and vegetarians. Secondary outcomes were optimism, well-being, positive emotions, and meaning in life. And we have similar findings where most studies showed no significant differences. So we also wanted to see if we can determine some kind of quantitative relation in addition to qualitative. So we found, and that was primarily done, I need to emphasize, on the primary outcomes only, because we only had very, very small number of studies for the secondary outcomes. So we had individuals who consumed meat had greater positive mental health comparing to individuals who did not, who abstained from meat. But there was no difference in self-esteem and no difference in satisfaction with life. And most secondary studies show no group differences, even from the qualitative perspective. And here is a graph similar to what we have seen before, only on positive mental health. We only had 4 studies so far were conducted on this variable. And we see again the effect sizes and the overall effect size, which was similar to what we saw for anxiety in terms of the size. So, what does all this mean? What do we take from this? Well, overall, we found that meat abstention is associated with greater depression levels, greater anxiety levels, also greater self-harm, as well as lower positive mental health. And we also did, for the first review, second meta-analysis where we compared depression and anxiety, we were interested, are there any differences between males and females? And there was no differences between the groups. And past research reports or demonstrates that females are more likely to report mental health disorders. But in our review, we did not find that difference. And we also showed that study quality does play a great role in the relation between mental health and diet. So it's very important for the researchers to try to do rigorous studies, such as, for example, use probability sampling, random sampling, for example. Preferably use objective type of assessment rather than a memory-based assessment, right? Asking individuals, what did we eat in the past week? So some of the strengths and limitations of the articles of this literature are that primarily, yes, limitations, assessments, right? Even though in some of the articles, especially higher quality articles, some of them include that actually a physician diagnosed disorders, which was good, but most of them had a simple self-report. And every single study used 24-hour recalls or some sort of food frequency questionnaires, which is, again, not a very good way to measure what we consume. And a great deal of studies, especially lower level studies, used bias sampling, and they're also oversampled for meat abstainers. Whereas higher quality studies used matched sampling and more rigorous type of the recruitment of participants. A lot of articles, unfortunately, did not report complete demographic information. So, for example, participants' socioeconomic status, their lifestyle, which could definitely contribute to that relation. And we are, unfortunately, were unable to assess that due to lack of information. And we only had one randomized control trial. So overall, within our reviews, we're unable to say that diet causes mental health disorders. We cannot say that because most of the studies were correlational studies. And we're also unable to say anything regarding the temporal effects or temporal inferences because I believe there was only one longitudinal study, right? And most of them were simple cross-sectional. So that's a great limitation in terms of the literature within itself. And of course, some of the limitations and strengths of our reviews. I think one of the greatest strengths was just asking individuals or having inclusion criteria, do you eat meat, do you not eat meat? Very simple. And we also, especially for the first couple reviews, we had well-defined constructs, the most prevalent mental health disorders, anxiety and depression. And with the reviews, there's also usually huge sample sizes. We had over 100,000 individuals within our review. And of course, there are many, many limitations. In addition to these two, we did not include non-English language studies, and also we excluded many studies. Due to, a lot of it was because we did not, for example, include Mediterranean diet or any other type of diets, but just simple distinction. So in terms of our recommendation, we definitely urge the researchers to use more objective assessments, both for mental health as well as diet. Use probability sampling, such as preferably random sampling. Try to do complete reporting in terms of the participants, and definitely use more rigorous designs, such as experimental studies, randomized controlled trials, longitudinal studies, look at individuals' mental health as well as their diet over time. We'll be able to answer more questions. So overall, our findings do not support veganism and vegetarianism as a strategy to benefit psychological health. And perhaps focusing more on nutritional sort of quality of our food may be more important. So for example, do we eat foods that have minerals, that have vitamins, that have proteins, that have carbohydrates, that have fats, water, and so on, rather than we can eat whatever we want, right? As long as we meet those nutritional sort of things that our body needs. Any questions?
Round of applause. Any questions? We can open that up for the...
Yep.
I had a question about the measuring of food intake. I mean, do they do, like, people do diaries on these, food diaries? Is that part of these studies? Because it seems like the memory part is, you know, where people report stuff that is socially acceptable, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But if you have a diary, you're probably going to get a little bit more accurate. Are those in use? I mean, those are massive numbers of people who are involved in these things.
Right. I believe with that specific data set, and hence they do not do the diary, but other studies definitely use them. Yes, they can be a little more reliable and valid, but then there is still a question, right? How big is the portion?
Right.
So there is another issue that doesn't completely solve that problem. But yes, it's definitely better versus what did we eat yesterday.
And most of the studies weren't using food diaries, though.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember any of the study that we included in reviews had any of that. Mainly were 24-hour recalls or food frequency questionnaires. Yeah, and a lot of studies also ask kind of how much, right, to what extent do you eat, rather than are you a smoker or are you non-smoker, right? Just simple categorization. Because every time we ask, like for example, similar is with calories, right? I have no idea how many calories I eat per day. I don't count, right? And even the food labels that we see on the foods, they are plus minus 20%. Meaning that you can add 20% to what it shows, and you can minus 20% of what it shows. So it's a great, like you have 40% of discrepancy there. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
In your research of looking at the meta-analysis of the articles, how far does some of them get to not necessarily treat it as a nominal variable of meat eaters or not meat eaters, but more so the food source of the meat, grass-fed versus GMO corn, or even looking at gut health diets more so than just those two nominal?
Yeah, there was none of that was reported in articles.
Okay.
So primarily what we were looking for in terms of the inclusion, as long as they provided the definition of what do they mean by vegans, vegetarians, and kind of omnivores or eating everything.
Okay.
As long as we had that information, we used the study.
Okay.
But to my knowledge, none of the articles included any of the, you know, organic or grass-fed or
Sure.
any of that.
Okay.
Yeah. Good questions. Yep.
You know, I have another question. So,
Sure.
you know, like, I was thinking, oh, right, I see what this is, and it's really, really neat that you've done all that research on you know, meta-analysis, and that's a huge, you know, undertaking, considering all the different, you know, a lot of times whenever I hear about food and health, they have like ends of 15 and 20, so I really appreciate it, you know, that's really a real contribution. The question I have is like, could you say maybe that it's not the food, it's that the people who are vegetarian are a minority, right? And they feel deviant, right? And that they're like in a, you know, they go to Thanksgiving and then they're like, oh, they had this, you know, conflict at their, you know, with their family about what they're eating, and I wonder if there's like a little bit of that going on where, you know, the meat eaters may be more normatively part of society, and I don't know if you've thought about that.
Yeah, no, definitely there is, and I forgot to mention in terms of what are some of the reasons, right?